Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, huge crowds turn out in Kinshasa to welcome the opposition team of Félix Tshisekedi and Kamerhe as they return to campaign for the presidency in next month's polls. Also, Sub-Saharan Africa is home to a third of the world's refugees and is struggling to support their education needs. A new international report on education calls for this to be made a priority, even in low-income countries struggling with their own education infrastructure. And Ghana's Atewa Range Forest Reserve is one of the most biodiverse places on Earth, but there are fears that lives, livelihoods and wildlife there could be under threat because of plans to ramp up mining of bauxite. But first, on Tuesday, two of DR Congo's main opposition leaders returned to Kinshasa. Tens of thousands of people turned out to greet Félix Tshisekedi and Kamerhe after they flew in from Addis to kick off campaigning for next month's presidential election. They'll be running on a joint ticket in the race. Nicolas Chemin has more.
After weeks of political turmoil, two of Congo's main opposition leaders are back in Kinshasa. Félix Tshisekedi and Kamerhe had initially signed a deal to back the candidate Martin Fayulu. But 24 hours later, they reneged on the deal, saying their supporters rejected it. Now, Kamerhe is campaign manager for the candidate Tshisekedi.
We have a program that we're still working on. We need to unite both our projects so that we can present a good program to the people.
A large crowd greeted them in the streets of the capital. Unlike Fayulu, both men are not opposed to the electronic voting machines that are to be used in December's poll. Their supporters had heard their message clearly.
With or without the machines, we will vote. We will win.
We will go to the election in December with or without the voting machines.
According to an opinion poll published before the Fayulu candidacy, the two men who returned on Tuesday were the two favourites. The poll was carried out by the respected Congo Research Group. This week, it warned that in the current context, holding elections next month could worsen the conflicts in some regions of Congo. The EU observers have not been invited to supervise the poll, and the opposition says the electoral roll is unreliable. Towards the end of the day, tensions rose and the police fired tear gas. This promises to be a fraught electoral campaign.
Well, following a hearing on Tuesday, the trial date for 10 Cameroonians linked to an English-speaking secessionist uprising has been set for December 6th. The group could face the death penalty if found guilty. Amongst them is Julius Ayok Tabe, who's an Anglophone separatist leader. Tabe and his co-defendants were amongst 47 Anglophone Cameroonians arrested in Nigeria and deported to Cameroon in January. The remaining 37 suspects are still being held and have not yet been charged. Hundreds of Tunisians, took to the streets to protest against a visit from Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince on Tuesday. Crowds accused Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of being a murderer as he arrived on a visit to Tunis. Prince Mohammed's reputation's come under pressure after Turkish sources suggested that he'd given the order to have Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi killed and dismembered at a consulate in Istanbul 6 weeks ago. These claims have been strongly denied by Saudi Arabia. Well, Sub-Saharan Africa houses almost a third of all the world's refugees. On top of the millions of internally displaced people, that puts a huge strain on education systems, some of which may already be struggling. But in a new report, UN researchers say that education should and must be a priority, even amongst people on the move. Whilst some countries in the region, like Uganda, Chad, Ethiopia, Kenya and Rwanda, have actively tried to address the issue, there is still a long way to go. It's a multifaceted and expensive problem. Katarzyna Kubacka is one of the researchers behind the report. She tells us more.
Our report is called Global Education Monitoring Report, and it looks at how education and people on the move, how these two aspects interact. And I think among the biggest challenges is, for instance, provision of qualified and trained teachers for refugees and migrants, making the curriculum and textbooks inclusive, and fundamentally providing the right to education for everyone, including migrants and refugees, and providing them a right to education together with the host community within main public schools.
I mean, in theory, everyone has a right to an education, but you're talking about populations, refugee populations in countries that are already low income, that are already struggling to provide the infrastructure for its own native communities. So how is that balance supposed to be struck?
Exactly, that's a very good point. These refugees in Sub-Saharan Africa often also end up in regions which are even more, which struggle even more than the country in general. And so there's this additional challenge. And of course, often they're in classrooms which are big. So you can imagine a teacher teaching a classroom of 120, 150 students, and then with multiple languages. And so we see examples of countries who are trying to tackle this challenge in the region. I mean, among them, for instance, Uganda, which has brought together development and humanitarian aid partners to develop education plan and finance education for both host and refugee children for the next 3 years.
But what about the refugees themselves? I mean, we're talking about millions of people. Surely amongst them, there must be a number of teachers who themselves could be part of the solution to the problem that they're also part of.
Exactly. That's also a point that we raised in the report, and the sort of untapped potential often of refugees in general with many different skills, and in particular of teachers, because we know that there's a huge shortage of teachers in many of these countries in general, qualified and trained teachers. And especially in refugee contexts, refugees, youth and children are often taught by untrained and unqualified teachers who, again, are teaching in these very challenging classrooms. But there are some obstacles in many countries for refugee teachers to be teaching in public schools. Among them, one and foremost one is the recognition of their qualifications from the countries from which they stem from. But again, there are some good examples in the region. For instance, in Chad, there is a program which aims to upskill teachers and also to recognize their qualifications and make them, to enable them to teach in public schools in Chad. And that's one of the good examples that we point to in the report. But at the same time, there is a challenge in many other countries to actually recognize the qualification of the teachers to enable them to teach in public schools.
So what's the cost of not paying attention to the educational needs of displaced refugee migrant communities in Sub-Saharan Africa?
I think the potential cost, I mean, first of all, is the loss of human potential and the human potential. There are students who cannot attend school or who attend school which are impoverished or which also maybe are discriminatory. They're also more likely to drop out and then become marginalized potentially and frustrated. And we have some examples in the report of cases where these students are also maybe more vulnerable to just, changing their life for the worse in general in many
antisocial
different
behavior.
ways. Exactly, antisocial behavior, for instance. So yes, I mean, there's a huge cost to both the students who cannot attend education, also to the adults whose skills are not recognized and whose qualifications are not recognized in host countries.
Well, now, it's been described as one of the best places for biodiversity on the planet, but there are fears that Atewa Range Forest Reserve in Ghana is under threat because of the government's plans to ramp up mining in the area. Take a look.
The Atewa Range Forest Reserve is home to some of the world's most critically endangered animals. But under the ground are also large reserves of bauxite, the mineral that makes the earth red and which is a key ingredient in making aluminium. Ghana's government has signed a multi-billion-dollar deal with China to allow them to mine bauxite in exchange for vital infrastructure projects. The land around the reserve has previously been affected by illegal gold mining.
We are going in for big trouble because the way bauxite mining is done is not like gold, where you can take out the sand, put it somewhere, and then fill it back. You're actually taking away the whole soil, and with it you have to clear the forest to be able to get to that.
Environmentalists say any pollution of the 3 rivers that have their source in the forest could affect millions of people downstream, including in the capital, Accra.
Being a national park and then establishing tourism activities here would help us better than the bauxite mines.
Aluminium ore prospectors first came to the area more than a decade ago. Samples from their drilling have been abandoned. Some say investors pulled out because mining would have been too controversial. Others say it's needed to bring about greater prosperity.
There's no job, so we want bauxite mining to come. Morally, we want it to come, so that our people get a job to do.
Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo is from the main town of Kiebi, on the eastern slopes of the forest. He's promoting rural development, but there's a growing campaign to stop him achieving it at the expense of the environment he's vowed to protect.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us, and do so again if you can. Take care.